Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the European Demography Forum. Those of you who were here this morning had already some very nice sessions. We will continue this afternoon with another great sessions. You can participate in the discussion, and to do so, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You have seen this already in one of the opening slides. Type your question there, and you can already start typing your questions during the presentation. So that will speed up the discussion afterwards. And as we have limited time, I advise you to do so. So now we continue with a presentation that seems to combine the best of two worlds. It is on a Europe of pro-elderly welfare states within child-oriented societies. And presentation will be by Professor Pieter Vanhuysse, who is professor of the Department of Political Science and Public Management at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. You have the floor, Pieter. Please unmute yourself.
So my screen is visible to all, I assume?
Yes.
Thank you, Nico, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So what I intend to do in the 50 minutes or so that follow is to give you sort of some of the early answers we have been providing with a host of co-authors, notably with Robbie Gall from the Hungarian Demographic Institute, on what may seem to be a very generic, albeit important question, basically how many resources do generations in Europe give or receive from each other? What we think we do in this set of projects is to try and shine a wider light on what is not visible in relation to that question. I'll be coming back to that metaphor in about 5 minutes or so. And what we try to do is to shine a wider light on the household economy, on what benefits are received when we also look at the household economy, cash, but also time, unpaid household labor is a key element here. And what follows, and that'll be the second part of my talk, for how we appreciate, appraise, and even value the contributions of parents in raising the next generation, particularly the public good elements or aspects or dimension of children. And sort of a starting point in our observations is the fact that, you know, too obvious to be even noticed perhaps, there's a strange asymmetry in the way we socialize how we take care of different generations, wide across the rich world and wide across types of welfare regime and so on. And we use the welfare state, working age people as a generation, pay taxes and transfers overwhelmingly to care for the elderly, their parents as a generation, through the tax and transfer tools of what we call welfare states. We socialize that care upward. And yet, probably too obvious to be true or to be reflected on, we still overwhelmingly, public education systems notwithstanding, take care of raising our own children privately. And so that's a very interesting asymmetry in the way we take care of different generations as middle-aged net productive generations, which of course is very closely linked to one of visibility. Yeah? So the key second asymmetry we think is very simply the fact that, you know, what we spend through the tax and transfer arm of welfare states upwards in pension contributions and what we get at the elder part of the life cycle in pension benefits or healthcare or long-term care is basically rather completely observed and observable in national accounts. Much less so, of course, what we do downstream in the cash and especially in the time that we spend, you know, raising children. So to come back to my earlier metaphor of shining a wider light, if we then answer the question, the generic one I started with, you know, what and how many resources do we transfer among each other in Europe? If we answer that question, as I have been guilty of, and many others in the social and public policy field have been guilty of, by just looking at public transfers, welfare states, realm of society, it's a little bit like, you know, the proverbial drunk at night who's looking for his lost car keys only where the streetlight shines. Yeah? We look at welfare state public transfer data because we have them fully readily available, which is why we look at how, for example, to take an illustration of what I've done earlier in my research, how welfare states are, for example, pro-elderly biased or not. Yeah? But of course, that may be a very incomplete picture, bad enough, but we argue here it may also be a very biased picture. So what I've done in the first set of questions with Robert Gall and Lily Varga is to, by using national transfer accounts and national time transfer accounts, so it's shining a wider light on the household economy of especially time, unpaid household labor, ask the same question in a sort of a wider framework. In this first set of results I want to share with you, we look at 10 countries, about 70% of the EU population, and covering most welfare state regime models. By way of preview, the earlier work in the social policy community, for example, has been or can be validated. European welfare states, all of them that we checked, as welfare states, as tax and transfer, public transfer machinery tools, do indeed, as per previous work, are found to be significantly spending more per capita resources to the currently elderly than to the elderly young. That's the first part of our title, pro-elderly welfare states. However, if and when we then do shine that wider light by taking private transfers and especially unpaid household labor into account, time, if you like, the picture isn't just more complete, it changes. All of a sudden, societies as societies, which is of course a wider umbrella, if you like, than welfare states, now tend or are found to be transferring more per capita resources to children in Europe on average than they do to the elderly. And that covers the second part of the title of today's talk. So here's how that looks. On your left-hand side, we have the standard way that national transfer accounts look at what they call the LCD, the life cycle deficit at any stage or age of life. And the horizontal axis is just ages. We get or we give in net terms resources. And so here on the vertical axis, you see this as controlled for basically prime age labor income, the income of, in each of these societies, we look at the average 30 to 49-year-olds. And what is above the horizontal axis is, of course, receipt, net receipt of transfers. What is below it is net production or giving of transfers. On the left-hand side, in terms of cash, in the middle panel, and this is why we do believe that the picture is also transformed, we see our estimate of time transfers, yeah, of what happens when you try, as we have tried, to put a price tag, as it were, on the minutes per week people of all different ages across Europe spend in unpaid household labor, you know, gardening, cleaning, cooking, and so on, bedtime stories. What have you got? And just a visual eyeball of these two first panels shows you that the shape of these curves is quite radically different. One thing that this method allows us to do is to actually also, if you like, inductively or empirically define what it means to be young, what it means to be old in this context. Yeah? So not as per tradition, childhood lasting to 18, as we have been doing for over a century, or as per tradition, you know, old age starts around, what is it today, 65, 68 or so. But we just inductively define childhood as the point at which in the early part of life, one crosses from being a net recipient to a net producer of transfers. And the same again at the latter stage of life. So looking at the, for example, the left-hand side of the picture, you see that, you know, that already looks or leads to different conclusions about how long are we adult in that context or in that definition, the resource productive definition of life stages. When it comes to the transfers, as you see on the left-hand panel, childhood lasts not till 18, but until about 25. And adulthood then lasts again, not until 67 or so, or 65, but it starts as young or as early as 60. So that's one conclusion you can draw from this exercise, the net resource productive adulthood in Europe. But then when we look at the middle panel, which is just time transfers alone, you can see that the story is very different. Mainly parents, rather than grandparents, incidentally, mainly parents in their 30s and 40s are giving mainly to the very young children, naturally one could say, enormous amounts of time, or if you like, of prime age labor income from their time. So when we then, in the third panel, on your right-hand side, combine what we call the fuller picture, the wider light that we shine on the question of resource transfers, by here combining, if you like, the market economy and the household economy, cash transfers from the state, from families, as well as time transfers, you see that, the picture becomes one of a very strong resource recipiency, quite heavily or quite long into childhood. And then the same again from around age 60, but less so, hence how we came up with our title. In the end, in per capita terms at least, and when we shine it wider light by looking also at the household economy, Europe turns out to be a continent composed of families, mainly parents, to be more precise, that are very child-oriented in their resources. So to give you an example, children right in the first 10 years of their lives, by this calculation, receive something like 129 to 92% of prime age labor income in their society. That's to say something in the range of 16 months of wages to around 11 months of wages, which is more than even the very oldest receive in overall resources. Young Europeans, one cannot literally call them children anymore, keep receiving right until they reach age 17 on average in Europe. So right until they are legally or traditionally adults and can start voting, something in the range of 70% of prime age labor income, which is what at the other side of the life cycle we find elderly Europeans to be receiving only from age 80. So here's how this symmetry that I mentioned earlier looks visually according to these calculations. The left-hand side is basically, if you like, the welfare state, which is, as you can see, a pro-elderly oriented tax and transfer machine. The right-hand side shows the cash and especially the time transfers, which, as you note, are very front-loaded in the very earliest lives of years of children's lives. The picture matters, of course, because, as I mentioned, shining that wider lights makes it not just more complete. We believe it also flips the story, right? Flips the story from when we look at public transfers, a child-elderly ratio of around 40%, 0.39, children receiving quite a lot fewer per capita resources from the state than do the elderly, flipping to something in the range of 2.23, 223%. Overall, when we include the household economy, what families, but really what parents do, the ratio literally flips around. And yet, few, I believe, would dispute the fact that a significant element of the production of children into adults, functioning adults, if you like, is an externality, a positive externality to society that parents provide. So clearly parents raise their children for a whole host of reasons, including private pleasures and so on, but clearly also, if and when children are successfully raised to become, productive, well-functioning, tax and transfer paying adults, innovators, and so on, their contributions can then be used, for example, to finance the older age of people who never have been parents, non-parents. Technically, it would be entirely possible for welfare states to link at least a component of the transfers at elderly ages to prior human capital investment. That's possible technically, but of course empirically, it cannot be observed. Very few cases exist of such linkages between the human capital investment of people and then their later life, if you like, benefit streams. So that brings us to the second part of my talk and of another project within the larger set of papers we're working on. This particular one is again with Robert Gall from the Hungarian Demographic Research Institute, and also this time with Márton Megyesi from the Tarki Independent Social Institute, where we try to ask, okay, so what about parents? Can we say something about the more precise about, what parents do, what parents contribute in sort of transfers as compared to non-parents. So to start with, we do a very similar exercise with a fewer more countries, 14 now as opposed to 10, as what I've been showing you. On the left-hand side, you see here the public transfers over the life cycle. Very similar pattern or profile as before. On the right, you see here now the net familial transfer, both cash and time together. And once again, well, one thing that you already noticed is that on the public side, these transfer stories are a 3-generational affair. So both children and even more so the elderly significantly receive transfers, public transfers from the middle age to the working age. On the other hand, familial transfers of cash and time, basically and possibly controversially, we find to be a 2-generational affair from adults in working age or just somewhat later, right until around, let us say, 70 or so, to children. Already from some point in the mid-60s, there is still, as we can see, some positive contribution in family transfers by the 65 pluses, but essentially already from 65 onwards, it becomes very marginal, at least compared to what your average 35, 45-year-old in Europe provides. So how to tackle that question? Very difficult one in methodological terms. And in a nutshell, what obviously, we do realize that parenthood is something for life. Most parents would claim that they are a parent for life. But for our purposes, we define parenthood as something that actually has to do with, supporting children. So partly for also data availability reasons, in the surveys we use here, which are mainly EU Silk and the Harmonized Household Budget surveys, we hear, that's a call we make, consider parenthood in binary terms. You are either a parent or you're not. We don't look at parents in multiple terms of 2, 3, 4 or more children. And equally importantly, we make the call to define, for our purposes, parenthood as cohabitation with children in the base year, in this case, 2010. So by that definition here, we do not capture as parents, at least, or we do not define as parents biological parents who are divorced and therefore no longer living together, or non-cohabiting old parents. Of course, we capture what they do, but in terms of inter-household transfers, what we can do with this definition is to capture foster parents, non-biological parents, if and when they cohabit with the child in question and self-declare themselves to be parents. The surveys have that possibility. And then empirically, simply, as a matter of observation, it follows that this binary cohabitation-driven definition restricts essentially parenthood to the working ages. We have basically very low cell frequencies for after 65 or so. You know, brand new families with younger children, but composed of, you know, an older and a younger partner would be one example of older parents by definition. Older parents living with their adult children would be another, but just, you know, in Europe today, this is just a very low frequency. So here's how that looks when we look at, again, public and familial transfer packages, now by parenthood status, de facto in working life, where the red lines are non-parents and the blue ones are parents. And so just to repeat, so these figures are cross-sectional for around 2010. They're again per capita figures. This time they cover 14.10 countries, around 70% of the EU population. And here again, we can define active age inductively or empirically. So clearly, when we look at the left panel, the public transfer panel, the age profiles of non-parents and parents are altogether not very different. Yeah. So it turns out that non-parents provide more resources early in their adult lives or careers, the red line. Yeah. And then there's a switch around age 44 or so, but altogether, there's not a major transfer burden difference. Very different story, of course, when we look at the right-hand panel at familial intra-household transfers, partly, of course, by definition. We find that here the story is very different. So non-parents hardly provide any familial transfers. One example would be, you know, young 20-something still living at home, and by so doing contributing to the financing of the consumption in the household. That would be one example of non-parents providing familial transfers. But again, that's as a matter of empirical observation, a very limited amount. Parents, of course, in addition to what we see on the left-hand side, provide in, I believe, 13 out of our 14 countries, not just as many, but even more transfers in the familial realm, if you like, than they do on the left-hand side. So for 13 out of our 14 countries, the surface on the right for parents is bigger than it is on the left. Then we do a transversal exercise where we, like in generational accounting, for example, try and, okay, estimate this in terms of then the working life transfer package. The transversal story here basically tries to transfer using assumptions about growth rates, about discount factors, and so on. What we just showed, the 2010 snapshot, if you like, into what it might look like over the working life of parents for the different countries in our sample. And lots of observations here, we might come back to them. The first would be the 1.8 the final ratio, where all things considered, our estimation is that the full package in this transversal exercise of parents is about 1.8 of that of non-parents. Interestingly, the two leaders within the sample of 14 countries in Europe are Nordic countries, where parents provide around 2.1 times as much as non-parents do, taking the family realm and the public realm together. So to conclude, this, supposing anything like this 1.8 is sort of realistic, does it then mean that de facto we are taxing, maybe not intentionally, but de facto we are taxing parenthood? Certainly, you know, public finance, economics will tell you, well, you know, if you tax price inelastic activities, that's optimal, that minimizes dead weight losses. Yeah? So to the extent that, you know, parents, if you like, love their children, they're not very elastic in their demand for children, price elastic, it might well be that so-called optimal taxation is wildly suboptimal societally in terms of, you know, the under provision, if you like, of the public good called children. we can debate the implications, would be glad to do so. But perhaps let me leave you, if I may, with this final graph, where you see basically average data for the first 20 years of the social investment paradigm in Europe. The social investment revolution happened sometime by common consent around, the OECD job study of 95 or shortly thereafter. And so what you see here for Europe are the data spent on what many people would agree is the one clear case in social policy of a true, rather than a metaphorical, a literal investment, spending on early childhood care and education. Where if you, take the work of Heckman and many others on board, you see that actually these dollars spent on early childhood provide astonishing rates of social rates of return to society above what they give to children. And yet, the question then would be 20 years after the start of the social investment paradigm, why don't we see more social investment, except in Nordic Europe, possibly, and France? And with that question, let me thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Pieter, for giving a very rich presentation on these intergenerational economics, actually. And thank you also for indeed adding to all these public transfers, also the familial and the private transfers. We are running a bit short of time. I do not see many questions in the Q&A box or in the panel. Panelists can raise their hands. I have a question, though. I was a bit surprised that this two generational thing about time investments in the family sphere. And what about things that we discussed yesterday, the sandwich generation? What about the role of grandparents? I'm a grandparent myself. I invest quite a lot of time. That does not come back in your data. So if you can have a short answer to that, that would be illuminating for me as a grandparent also.
Yes, so I flagged this already, that we realize this may be controversial. Certainly, there's a lot of literature these days, the last 20 years, 70 is the new 60. People of a certain age are actually physically fitter, mentally fitter. They want to contribute. So we know about that. We simply do not find this in our data. And our theory for this is a post hoc explanation, is very simply that when it really matters, or what really matters when it comes to these intergenerational transfers in the family, in the household economy, is what we call household public goods. That's to say, whatever is produced for those who live under the same roof. And typically, think about a mother cooking spaghetti at 7 in the evening for herself, of course, and of course her children and her husband, or something like that. That time is then divided. Yeah? Of course, parents, grandparents. We know, with the exception of Southeastern Europe, and a little bit still, but even that is a declining Southern Europe, 3 generational households are becoming extinct in Europe, yeah? with those 2 minor exceptions and declining exceptions. So that element we are losing in Europe. Yeah? So even when it may well be the case that grandparents come in and do babysitting and so on the whole, compared to these, what we call these household public goods, it is empirically just so much smaller. Yeah?
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Agnieszka Klon-Dominczak from Poland.
Hi, Agnieszka.
It's important also to take into account educational background. Our analysis for Poland showed that there are changes between 2004 and 2013 in the time transfers, but also differences between people who have higher and below higher education.
Oh, absolutely. There's a couple of actually elephants in my room still, admittedly. Yeah? Look, I've been talking about parents. I haven't so far spoken a word about mothers, yeah? to start with, hidden elephants in the room. And indeed, Agnieszka, class, or one of its versions, human capital, is key there. Yes. We know already for a while from Sarah McLanahan and others, Gustav Sping Andersen has been homing in on this message forever, that we have this increasing divergence. Even Putnam for America has written a book on the fact that we have this new driver of inequalities which are basically to do with indeed how parents, if you like, or partners are becoming increasingly homogeneous in terms of not just class, but even human capital. And that is certainly one of the elephant in this room. It is one I'm trying to, with Robert Gall and others, to tease out. So stay tuned.
Okay, we will, and definitely also the diverging destinies that we are referring to are
Precisely
indeed a very, very important part of the agenda. Thank you very much for your presentation, very rich, and I'm sure there will be lots of discussions later, but unfortunately for now, we have to end